Good afternoon and welcome to CUNY-NYSIEB's second seminar on the potential of dynamic bilingualism and translanguaging in bilingual education. My name is Sarah Hesson and I'm going to be your host today. So today the study group will be led by Ofelia García, who is a professor here at CUNY Grad Center in Urban Education and Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian Literatures and Languages. We're going to hear from Dr. Garcia, and after which you will have time to ask some questions. And then at the end, there will be another time to ask questions. So part one will be about understanding language. Then part two, understanding bilingualism. And finally, understanding translanguaging and its use in education. Without further ado, I would like to present to you Ofelia Garcia. Hi, Ofelia.
Hi, Sarah. I'm so happy to be with you today. The objectives of this webinar today, we're going to try to divide it into three segments. The first segment will be about understanding language. The second segment about understanding bilingualism, and finally the third segment, we're going to try to get into translanguaging and its use in education. Now, I want to remind you that the next webinar is April 27th, and there we will discuss direct applications of translanguaging to bilingual education. We are going to start today in a theoretical mode, and I want to tell you that Dr. Maite Sanchez, who is the project director, told me that perhaps this was not a good way to start because we were doing this for teachers, and I thought that this was the right way to start because we all have to understand what it is that we're doing. So the first part then is what is language, and I want you to think about that as I discuss that. I think in schools you see language as just a system of structures, and you go over the words, the vocabulary the children need to know, the morphology, the syntax, the sounds, and you talk about parts of speech, and that's a way in which we've always seen language in school. Now, this, of course, has a tradition, and of course, this language as a system of structure was something given to us by Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist at the end of the 19th century, who said, and was the first one to say, that language was just a self-standing integrated system of structures. And he came up with this idea of la langue, the language, in which he said that what we have is just a system of structures that are really independent of individual users. This, of course, was then repeated by the very famous American linguist Noam Chomsky in the 20th century, who then talked about the fact that what we have is a context-free formal grammar, what he calls a universal grammar. That is, that all languages have this formal grammar in common, and that really there is the diversity of linguistic phenomena is just illusory. It's not real. But I'd like you to consider another way of thinking about language. It's a way in which the Bakhtin Circle engaged us with language. The Bakhtin Circle was a group of Russian linguists. The major figures there was Mikhail Bakhtin and Voloshinov. They, of course, were products of the Russian Revolution. And what they started to do was to think of how language registered the conflicts between the social groups. So a much more sociopolitical context of language. And they were actually arrested in 1929. And so they also thought of how language also was sociopolitical and how it was used by dictators, etc. But the concept that they came up with is that language is not a system of structures, but like I have in those images, that language is a process of social interaction with people. Bakhtin said, for example, that it emerges from the actions of speakers. So it is us that produce a language, and we all have a certain perspective and ideological positioning, and this, of course, is reflected in the ways in which we use language. Voloshinov said that language acquires life in concrete verbal communication and not in a system of language forms, nor in the individual psyche of speakers. From this concept given to us by the Bakhtin Circle, many have started to talk not about language, but about languaging. And as a Latin American myself, I take great pleasure in saying that it was Chilean biologists, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, who first started coining the term languaging, or at least that's how it was translated into English. And what they basically said was that a languaging is it's an activity. It's an activity of how we interact in order to orient ourselves to each other and to a subject, right? And this was also the idea behind A.L. Becker, an American linguist, who said that languaging refers to the ongoing process that can never be accomplished, that is always being created as we interact in the world, lingually. Now, this is very important for all of us who are in bilingual education to remember. That is, that language is ongoing. It is never finished. We are constantly doing it, and it is created as we interact. So this is a definition given to us by the Australian Alastair Pennycook, who says that language is an activity rather than a structure, is something we do rather than a system we draw on, and it's a material part of social and cultural life rather than just an abstract entity. That is, the focus then is on the speaker's creative and critical use of these linguistic resources that we all have to mediate these cognitively complex activities. Again, activity, something we do. So this idea, I think, is at the center of what I want to talk about today. The idea that language is not a structure, but that languaging, or language if you want to call it that, it emerges from the social and cognitive interaction that we have with others. So how does this shift from language as a structure to language as social interaction change your teaching? And I think that's an important question for all of us as we face the Common Core State Standards. I think the Common Core State Standards are very good in terms of recognizing the fact that language is a social and cognitive interaction, that it emerges from it. And I think whether you're reading or you're writing or you're listening and speaking, what the Common Core asks you to do with language is to act socially, to interact, right? To provide text evidence of key ideas, interaction with the text, to make inferences and identify main ideas, again, interaction with the text, to recognize the text structure, to associate knowledge and ideas from multiple sources and text, not only text, interaction with text, but also interaction with others, in writing, to produce these text types for various purposes, again, interaction, and in listening and speaking, and this is important, an important shift in the Common Core, the idea that we want to not only comprehend knowledge and ideas, but also present them both individually and collaboratively. This is an important shift, and I think it's important to recognize that this indeed is what language is in the Common Core. But of course, alongside that, we also have a remnant of what we used to see as language, and that we continue to see as language, which is language as a structure. And of course, there's a whole strand of the Common Core about language itself, not reading, not writing, not speaking, not listening, not acting, but actually the structure itself. And that, of course, has to do with the acquisition of standard grammar and usage, vocabulary, and this use of a standardized language. I think the important principle that I want you to understand here is that this shift of language to languaging, to action, means that the more you leverage the student's ability to do language, that is true language, using it as a verb, not as a noun, as an action that you do in interaction with others, the more opportunities students will have to successfully use conventions of a school language, either English or a LOTE, a language other than English, right? So this is very, very important, and it's especially important for our bilingual schools, because we often have the tendency to think that if students come in as emergent bilinguals, that is, as students who are just learning to act in the world with another language, what we focus on is the forms, the structure. And what we are saying is that if language emerges in interaction, in social interaction, in cognitive interaction, what you have to do is engage students in doing language, in languaging. And these opportunities, these affordances, will then create the conditions for them to start developing the school language, which, as we all know, they also have to fulfill. So that is the important message that I wanted to get across to you with this first segment. That is the idea that we have to start thinking of language not as a system of structures, but as a social interaction, something that we do, something that is never finished, because of course it depends on the interaction that we engage in, and that this has important consequences for the way in which you teach language, because indeed what you have to get the students to do is to do language, to interact with it, to interact with each other, to interact with the text, and that this interaction will indeed have as a consequence the development of forms that are part of what you call academic language, and I will call language for academic purposes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. We have a question from the audience at this time, and it might be something that you address later on in the presentation, but Elizabeth asks, how can we balance the language expected of students in academic settings with the idea of languages? What are some instances?
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that wonderful question. I think that the balance has to be unbalanced. In other words, what I think I'm saying is that what you have to get the students to do is to do language, right? To do language with the text, close readings, etc., and also with each other, right? That the way in which you develop the forms that I think all of us are concerned with, and certainly school is concerned with, because that's the way that that's what schools are for. Schools are really to develop these different ways of using language, right, from the ones that we use at home. So that, but the tendency often is to focus on the forms, because that's what we see. It's easy for us as teachers to recognize these forms that the children are using are not the correct ones. And I think if you shift your focus from the forms that the students are using to what activities could I do in a classroom that will get them to act with language. What I'm saying is that it is these affordances that you will set up as a teacher. Affordances of group work, so that there's collaborative thinking together, of using language together, affordances of being able to enter the text so that they know how to find key evidence, to infer, etc. Affordances to let them write argumentative essays, etc. And it is that is going to create, the forms are going to come along, is what I'm saying. But if you start the other way, which is a way that we often think of in schools, because it's important to, it's easy to recognize, then you are never going to provide the students with the voice that they need. And that's a good way of understanding it is take the emphasis off the forms and give them voice. And if you give them voice, and if they are engaged with their own voice, in reading, in writing, in speaking, in acting, in all the things that we do with language, in different ways, not just with words, but also with gestures, with the kinds of modalities that we have today, then the forms are going to come along, because they'll see them, they'll act on them, etc. So I hope that answers your question, Elizabeth. So now I'm going to continue with the second segment. And the second segment has to do with what is bilingualism. And this is an important question for all of us, for me, because I've been involved in bilingual education for many, many years now, for you, because you live it every day. And this is part of what you do. I mean, this is the essence of what you do. And as I talk, I think I would want you to think about what is bilingualism for you, right? I mean, usually we think of bilingualism as just being the sum of a first language and a second language, and the structures of these two languages, right? That's usually the image that we come up with when we think about bilingualism, just the addition. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the literature describes it this way. And what I want to argue with you is that the reason why they describe it this way is because all these original theories about bilingualism, and you have to remember that it's something that is very old, right? There has been multilingualism in the world for a very long time, and it's very prevalent. There are more multilingual people than monolingual people, and yet the scholarly work around bilingualism is rather new. I always say that when I started in this business, there were like two scholars who wrote about bilingualism: Einat Haugen, who was a Norwegian, and Uriel Weinreich, who was a Yiddish speaker. And those were the scholars that talked about bilingualism. And still, this is, again, the tradition that we have inherited, and people continue to talk about a first language added to a second language, an L1 added to an L2, and just the addition of these structures, of these boxes that then make us bilingual, right? And so a very smart linguist educator, Wallace Lambert, in the 1960s, when he started to work with Canadian families in Quebec, basically when Quebec started demanding that French be used and that it gained political power, the Quebecois won the elections. A group of monolingual Anglophones, English speakers, who were the majority, said, we want our children to become bilingual. And that was the beginning of the Canadian immersion programs that we will talk about more later. But Wallace Lambert also came up with this idea of additive bilingualism. And basically his concept, which has been a very useful and good concept, was that although most of the world took children who spoke one language at home, and when they went through school, they became speakers of the second language. That was what he called subtractive bilingualism, because the school was taking their language and subtracting it, of course, from their own repertoire and putting a second language in them, right? But he came up with this idea of children could also be bilingual. You could, in school, develop additive bilingualism. Except as we started to use it, people started interpreting additive bilingualism as just the balance of two. That is, two monolinguals in one, right? I like to use the image of the bicycle, the thinking that what we have are two balanced wheels that always go in the same way, right? But what we know, and I think all of us know this, and if you're a teacher, you certainly know this, is that none of us are balanced bilinguals, right? That it is impossible, of course, to be a balanced bilinguals, because after all, we use one language with some people for some purposes, in some occasions. I'm speaking English now, of course, and we use the other language with other people for other occasions, so that it's impossible to be balanced, again, because if language is the interaction with our social context, if language is interaction, our interactions are different, and therefore the languages that we engage with are going to be different. So what I want you to think about is that forever, but perhaps even more today, when everything is moving so fast, where we have technology and you can see me and I don't know where you are, and when this tremendous flow of goods, of information, of people, of course, lots of immigration. What we really have to understand is that the bilingualism that we have in our midst is not just a sum of two structures. Perhaps someone who learned Spanish, at Harvard, when they came into college, maybe they added something. But really, what we have today is a constant interaction, and that the bilingualism of our children emerges, again, not from adding structures to the ones that they already have, but actually from the interaction that they have, from the social and cognitive interaction that they have as they use the language, as they do the language, as they language, as they acquire voice, right? So this has led me to think of bilingualism not simply as being additive. Look, they're good additive things to bilingualism. It adds a lot to our lives. But bilingualism is not simply additive. Bilingualism is a lot more dynamic. And this is the concept that I've introduced of dynamic bilingualism. The idea that what we have as bilinguals is one complex linguistic repertoire that is used in social and cognitive interactions, and that it, like the banyan tree that I have in the cover of one of my books, this is all intermingled in some way. It is not just two separate trunks, but it is the interaction of all these experiences that we have as bilinguals that make up our trunk. So it's a good image to have, banyan trees. The other image that I use often is the idea that we just don't have a bicycle. We have an all-terrain vehicle. And what that means, of course, and I know if you're bilingual, you understand what I'm saying. What it is that children who are bilingual, those of us who are bilingual, our wheels are not always going in the same way, right? They're not always balanced in any way. But what we do is we put down one wheel or the other, depending on the social interaction, the communicative interaction that we have. That is, we adapt our wheels, if you want to say it that way, to the ridges and the craters of communication, right? So it is much more dynamic than simply a balanced bicycle. And what you have to do as a teacher, of course, in order to make sure that this bilingualism emerges, is to provide the affordances, that's a very good word, the affordances, the opportunities for one wheel to be put down at some times, another wheel to be put down at other times, and then to make sure that both wheels are down sometimes at the same time, because that is part of the interaction. So the idea, of course, is that these students that some of us classify and that schools classify as English language learners or even as limited English proficient are not kids that have holes. That is, they're not missing structures, but they have voices that emerge in interaction. That's why we in CUNY-NYSIEB call them emergent bilinguals, because these are emerging voices that emerge in interaction. You want to give them voice, you want them to do language, right? And the idea that these two languages for bilinguals are not just separate systems, but they are an interactive system with which we act and by which we do. And I quote here from a sixth grader. Sarah's going to like that because Sarah was a teacher at Amistad. Sarah Hesson, who was your host. But this was actually a child in Amistad who one day when I was asking him about English and Spanish, he said to me, "Even though Spanish runs through my heart, English rules my veins. And sometimes it is something that a child says that changes your whole perception of what is happening. And the minute he said that, I thought, okay, so how do we then design educational systems that actually support his whole system? Because after all, you cannot separate the blood of the veins from that of the heart, because then there's death. So how do you build up a whole system for this child? So bilingualism is a definition is just the idea that there are bilingual performances that are always dynamically negotiated in interactions as students adapt to the opportunities for bilingual voices in the communicative situation. So again, affordances to get them to use their bilingualism to communicate, to engage with the text, and to deal with the very sometimes fluid communicative situations in which they often are put, even in a classroom. So the question that I want you to think about as I take this information into the classroom is, how does this shift from bilingualism as simply the addition of a first language and a second language to bilingualism as dynamic performances, that is, as voicing, right, as giving voice in social interaction? How would this affect your bilingual teaching, right? And I think that that's important. It's important to think of if we make this shift, what happens then to your bilingual teaching? Traditional bilingual education structures usually separate the two languages very strictly, right? So there you have it, right? But that we sometimes police language. We tell the kids, this is English time and you can only use English, and this is Spanish time and we can only use Spanish, or whatever. I want you to think about who you're teaching, because even though that may be a way of getting monolinguals to develop an additional language, right? It is certainly not the way, and even that, I think, today is being questioned, right? I mean, Jim Cummins has begun to talk about bilingual solitudes in immersion programs, as the idea that if you separate the languages so much, the kids cannot use what they have. They cannot leverage what they have in order to make meaning, right? But certainly for a bilingual child, this separation sometimes causes the tension that they don't need. And after all, we're educating, and we're educating, yes, to develop bilingualism, but we're educating the child, right? It's very important for all of us to remember that our purpose in life is not simply to develop an additional language. Our purpose in life is to educate the child, a bilingual child. And so that has to be our focus. How do we do that? So I think all we're saying in CUNY-NYSIEB is that you have to have these spaces. Yes, a space for English and a space for Spanish. Sometimes not for the children, but because of all of you, because it is important to have these spaces. But you have to do it with some flexibility. You have to get them to use English and use Spanish or the language other than English, but with some flexibility. Notice the difference between saying, I want you to speak English or get out, or aquí hablamos español, as something that you are, with the imperative, something that you're saying is either this or nothing, to let's speak English or se habla español. So a lot more flexibility in these spaces so that children know, yes, we are now practicing, I'm giving you the affordance to do this in Spanish, or I'm giving you the affordance to do this in English. But look, we want to leverage all that you have, so you can have some flexibility in the way in which you do it, especially because our bilingual programs are full of children who are at a continuum of bilingualism. We keep thinking that children are either English dominant or Spanish dominant, or English speaking or Spanish speaking. And really what we have is we have a whole continua of bilingualism in our classrooms. So you have to be able to adapt the situation to the child who arrived yesterday and now he has to perform in English. So you have to show some flexibility there. And you have to be able to adapt to the child who is a second or third generation Latino, for example, in your classroom, and who now has to perform in Spanish. So you want to be able to give them rigorous instruction, a rigorous education. You want to be able to get them to read with rigor, to write with rigor, to speak with rigor, but they have to do that with whatever voice they presently have. And so you have to build in that flexibility. So now is your time to ask some questions on bilingualism and bilingual education, so that we can then get into the heart of the matter, of course, which is the topic of today's study group, which is translanguaging.
We have a question now from Kelly, and she asks, does this work the same even if you are an ESL or a TESOL teacher?
Oh, Kelly, that's a great question. We are trying to do these webinars to help bilingual teachers because they're the ones that have been abandoned in some ways, and we want to be able to support them and have a network for them of support so we can help out whenever they need to. But I'm glad that you asked about ESL or TESOL. Of course, and when I get to the next segment on translanguaging, I'll speak more about how that is also relevant for ESL teachers. The idea is always the same. You have to get the students to do language, to leverage it, to act and interact socially with the language that they have. And so if you want them to read a difficult book, and they arrived last week, you cannot just do that in English, of course. You are going to have to facilitate it by giving them a text which in whatever language they have. Let's say I've been speaking today about Spanish because it's just easier, but if you care about any other language, you should think about other languages. But you should really think about other languages. But certainly you want them to enter into the task not by giving them baby books, right, so that they can read, not by giving them books that have one word, not by telling them to perform just mechanically writing sentences, but by allowing them whatever voice they do have. And once they engage with that voice, especially if they know that the target is English language development, and students know this very quickly. I mean, they know that that's what they're doing in schools usually, right, is developing English, which is, after all, the language of power and prestige, even though we want to make sure that they understand that the languages they speak at home are also prestigious and also useful. But certainly, in order to provide the rigorous education that a TESOL and ESL teacher needs to provide, you have to be able to leverage whatever it is that they already own and make sure that they develop the language in interaction with whatever it is that they already have.
There's just one more question, actually, and this is from Juan Carlos, and he writes, many dual language programs limit English use during Spanish time to protect Spanish as a minority language. What do you make of this, and would you advocate more dynamic practices, even in a case where schools are separating English away from Spanish time for this purpose?
Carlos, in some way you take me to the next topic, but I'll answer your question now, and then we can repeat the same question in the next segment, because I think it's such an important question. I think that a minoritized language, Spanish in the U.S., I was speaking today to someone who works with Mixtecos in New York City. Any minoritized language, if we want to grow it, if we want to develop it, of course, needs some protection. I like to think not of maintenance of the language in that way, but I like to think of sustainability. I think it's a better word. And the idea, of course, is that you have to sustain Spanish in the U.S., You have to make sure that the children develop it, but within the context in which they're using it. We are, after all, bilingual communities, and the way in which we use Spanish in New York City is not, or in New York State, is really not the same way that we use Spanish in Mexico or Puerto Rico or wherever. And so we want to protect the children's ability to develop ways of using Spanish, of acting on Spanish, of doing Spanish in the US. And that means that many times there will be ways of speaking that they have that you might say are English, but from their perspective, it's not English, right? It is their language. I recently was at a place where they were developing a test for Spanish, and there was a picture of a child on a swing, right? And what was really interesting was that the test constructor thought that the child's utterance, me gusta por los swings, was wrong because swings was English. And I said to him, so do you accept all varieties of Spanish? And he said, yes, I accept hamacas, columpios, whatever. And I said, well, swings is to this child the same as hamacas and columpios. It is her Spanish. This child has grown up in New York, where all the parks have swings. They don't have hamacas, and so swings for her is not Spanish. It is the language that she speaks. So that's a type of, I think, sophistication that we have to have when we deal with bilinguals. So we're going to go on, and I hope you're not too bored, because we are going to now get into the heart of this, which is what is translanguaging. Translanguaging was the title of the book that I gave you to read. They were hard chapters, so I just want to make sure we understand what we mean by it. So I'm going to give you a definition first, because I think it's easy to get the definition. Translanguaging refers to the fluid language practices of bilinguals as they interact bilingually, and also a pedagogical approach that leverages those practices to develop those desired informal school settings. So just to emphasize, so I'm talking about fluid language practices, which happen as we interact bilingually, because we are all the time, but also at something that can be done in schools, pedagogy, but a pedagogy that leverages those fluid practices that we all have in order to develop those desired informal school settings, right? So I think that's what Carlos was asking about. How do we then make sure that we develop Spanish for academic context, English for academic context, right? So this is an image that we use in a forthcoming book. It's a book that I gave you a chapter from. We're going to read more about it on April 27th. But it's a book, an image that evokes for me translanguaging. We see that there are two sides to this, one English, one Spanish. Again, I'm using Spanish just for ease today, but really at the bottom what you have is you see that reflection. What you have is what comes together, and this is a way in which children experience a school, right? Experience their experiences. They don't experience it as this is home, this is school, but as a total experience. And I think what teachers then need to do is to read the river. I like to think of the river because, I think of it like in this new book, we call it the Translanguaging Corriente, or La Corriente, right? And I think it's important for all of us to know that sometimes that corriente is at the surface, so we hear it. Sometimes that corriente is all the way down here, right? We don't hear it. We say, you can only do it in Spanish, or you can only do it in English, and we don't hear it. But it's there. Whether we like it or not, it's there. And so one of the things that teachers have to do is know how to read the river, know what to look out for on the surface, what you hear the kids say and do, but also below the surface. What is back there? What is behind everything I'm saying in English? There must be something else. There must be some corriente running through me, and how do we identify that and use it, of course, to learn? So again, I want to say, because this is all linked, that translanguaging emerges from the social and cognitive interaction of students and teachers who learn to read the river, right? And that's where it emerges. It emerges here. I'm bringing the teacher in, right? It emerges from our interactions between peer interactions, but also the interactions that we have as teachers with our children. This is a diagram from the book. It sort of delineates traditional models of bilingualism, in which what we see is we have two languages, an L1 and an L2, a first language and a second language, with features. And by features, I mean the phonology, the sounds of the language, a lexicon, the words of the language, the morphology, the endings, the syntax, the word order. So we have features of one language and features of the other. Jim Cummins, very, very early, this pioneer, this incredible scholar of bilingualism, very, very early, told us that there was a linguistic interdependence between the first language and the second language. And he alleged that there was a common underlying proficiency to both languages. What I'm saying is something a little bit different. What I'm saying is that translanguaging is really not looking at it as two different systems, two different languages, but that from the perspective of the bilingual child, from the perspective of that child that said, me gusta por los swings, for her, what she has is one linguistic repertoire, right? Not two languages, one linguistic repertoire, which they then learn to divide into English and Spanish, right? So that what we do in bilingual classrooms is we teach the children, of course, what is English, what is Spanish. We teach them to use some features and to suppress other features, right? So that we constantly are saying, you can't do that, so that you're suppressing other features. But I think the important thing for you to remember is that from the speaker's perspective, what you have is you have the way in which you language. That's what you have, right? Now that then gets translated into two different socially constructed languages, that is real and that has consequences. But from the speaker's perspective, what we have is, of course, one repertoire. I want to make sure you understand me. Translanguaging is not simply code switching, right? And this is an example I also gave in the book, the idea that code switching is really from the perspective of, people talk about it as having two languages and going from one language to another. Now, translanguaging is a very different perspective, because the perspective, that the angle that we're taking is not the language per se. I said in the beginning, I don't care about the language per se. I care about the children who speak those languages, the children that have to be educated through those languages. So from the perspective of the bilingual people, it's like turning off the iPhone's language function. I don't know if you have an iPhone, but I have an iPhone, and when I text my family all the time, it drives me nuts, because I have to constantly, turn off English or Spanish or whatever, and I'm usually using all my features, because there's not a school telling me that I should be doing it in English or in Spanish. I'm just using all my resources. So that's what translanguaging is, if you can think of that. Here's another image that often people use, the idea that when you code switch, you are restricted to two colors, right? And when you translanguage, you allow the children to use the whole repertoire of colors, rather just not the two in separate kinds of ways, right? So it's not like you have a jar with colors that are red and a jar of colors that are blue, and you only let them use the red during this time and the blue during this time, but they always have the red and the blue available, and there are times in which you say, all right, now take the red and now take the blue, and there are times in which you let them do whatever it is they want to do so that they can create all the colors. I also want to say, to make sure I'm not misunderstood, that I'm not talking about translanguaging as simply Spanglish, right? Spanglish has a connotation of having being corrupted, being broken. When I ask kids, "What do you speak Spanish?" often the answer is, "No, I speak Spanglish," meaning their teacher told them that they didn't speak Spanish correctly, when that is the only way in which they speak Spanish at home, right? So that I think what is important for us to remember is that even though Spanglish is a notion of corruption, translanguaging is completely the opposite, is the possibility of growth and expansion. It's a resource, and it's a resource that allows them, if you want to, that's why it grows, right, to grow into a language used for academic purposes. So whereas Spanglish sort of gives you the idea this is corrupted and it's never going to develop into anything because, of course, there is no value in society for it. Translanguaging gives us a sense of there is value in society for it because, after all, it increases our creativity, our criticality, and enables us to think larger than we usually do. So in translanguaging classrooms are classrooms in which students and teachers dynamically negotiate these bilingual performances as teachers create the opportunities for bilingual voices to emerge and students adapt to those opportunities. So the question that I have for you in these last few minutes is, how does this shift from bilingual classrooms to translanguaging classrooms affects your bilingual pedagogy and bilingual education structures? I think what we're saying is that beyond this space where you want them to speak English with flexibility, remember, and this space in which you want them to speak Spanish with flexibility, remember, there must be also a space which you can build, maybe not every day if you don't want to, if you don't feel comfortable, but once a week, twice a week, in which the children are allowed to really use the two languages creatively to read, to write, to do research, to speak, to make presentations, to do PowerPoints, to act out, etc. So the idea is that, and sometimes it's just a bringing together of features so that they can really notice what are the features of English and what is the features of Spanish. If you never ever do that, if these two languages are always solitudes, as Jim Cummins calls them, and you never try to get them to act on it together, then they will never use their resources in ways that are advantageous. It will not be a resource for the community. It will not be a resource for the students. It will not be able to develop their creativity and their criticality. So now you may have some questions on translanguaging and bilingual education.
So this question relates to the last statement that you made, referring back to the idea of the bilingual solitudes that Jim Cummins discusses. Could you speak a little more about that idea and how a translanguaging space could transform?
Thank you, Sarah. Jim Cummins, as you know, has done a lot of work on bilingualism and bilingual education. But the immersion programs that were originally developed in Canada in the 1960s, that was a long time ago, are very different from the kinds of immersion programs that students need today. Back then, it was French and English, and there was no other consideration of other languages. Of course, the First Nations were there forever, but no one thought of them. But now, with the constant immigration into Canada, those spaces have been disrupted. That is, it's not just English and Spanish, English and French anymore, but there are many other languages. And by the way, we could say the same thing about New York State. So the idea that there are these two solitudes, that we always treat the education of these children as in English only or in French only, has been disrupted, has been contested now for many years, because we know that we can only leverage what we already have. Learning is active. When learning was thought of as something that the teacher did, banking education, that may have worked. But today, where we know that the only way we learn is in interaction with others, then those solitudes are no longer relevant. So again, and I want to be very careful with what I say. There is space for spaces that are separate with flexibility, but there's also space for a space to be created within classrooms in which the students see this as a continuum, not as solitudes.
This is from Suzette, and she asks, what do you recommend if a student chooses to use very little of the second language? How much flexibility can we provide in a dual language setting? At some point, should the student not be in a dual language setting?
Well, thank you, Suzette. That's a great question, because I think all students need to be in a dual language bilingual setting. By the way, you see how I say bilingual? Because I think it's time that we all start saying dual language bilingual settings, so that we realize that this is bilingualism we're talking about. But I think all students need to be in a bilingual classroom. I mean, not just those that are there now. There are very few there now, and I think more of children of all kinds should be in bilingual classrooms, and making sure that they develop other resources to learn and do in the global world of the future. But a child that is in a classroom and does not produce language doesn't mean that she is not developing language. Many of us have the experience of raising children who are bilingual, and they continue to speak English to us, and we continue to speak Spanish to them. And we know that when they grow up, because they are what we call passive bilinguals, receptive bilinguals, that is, they have it in them. If they are in interactions where they need to use the language, again, because language is in interaction, remember, that's what we started today, they have it, they grow it, they develop it. So that first of all, I would say that bilingual education is for everybody, not just for some, not just for the gifted, not just for the talented. It's for everybody, and we have to find ways, and we have to relax if they're not always producing it. Let them produce. After all, you're educating them, and if you have to educate them, then they have to be able to read and write, and have a love for reading and writing. And eventually they will start producing when they are in interactions that are meaningful to them. It may be that the classroom interaction is not meaningful enough.
This next question is from Varela, and she writes, I love and support the idea of dynamic bilingualism. However, sometimes I feel limited by the bilingual program or model we have to follow as part of the school. Can you share more ideas and ways to adapt our teaching to support dynamic bilingualism regardless of the program in place at the school?
That's a great question. We know that sometimes, and I don't like the word models either, because we kind of think that there has to be a model, right? So we know that many of the types of bilingual programs today were structured, of course, with this solitude in mind, right? Thinking of immersion programs for majorities, which is not the same as thinking of what do language minoritized children need. But I would say, Mariela, that there are two things that you need to remember. One is that you don't have to change it all. You take small steps, right? I always say you take small steps. That's why I say a translanguaging space, a creative translanguaging space. Maybe you do that once a week for a short period of time, in which the students are researching a question, and they can then use all the resources they have, all the language resources they have, or they're reading a book, or they're writing a play in which they're multilingual characters, or they're acting out a skit in where they're multilingual or bilingual characters, so that what you do, of course, is adapt. Because after all, teachers are in many, many ways the ones that are negotiating these language policies. You negotiate them all the time, so don't be afraid to negotiate this one. And I think eventually, when the administration sees how much your students work and what the kind of work that they do, they will be more supportive. But I think start small. I always say start small.
A big thanks again to Ofelia García for such a thought-provoking presentation today, as always, and to everyone who participated today, and for the wonderful questions that you sent in. We look forward to continuing this conversation with the study group in April, and we hope that you will also join us next week on March 16th for a presentation on elementary and middle schools. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with instructions on how to receive a $50 stipend for a webinar-related task. And the webinar will also be archived on our webpage, so check back in a week or two to be able to view this webinar and share it with others. As I said, the next webinar from 4 to 5 p.m. next week is on the principles and practices for elementary and middle schools, and the follow-up to the study group will be on Monday, April 27th. We look forward to seeing you then.
Gracias.